Do you know what the single most important verse in all of Jewish tradition says about whether your child will succeed in life? Not a theory, not a philosophy developed in some modern university. One verse, written thousands of years ago. And when I tell you what it actually says, what it says in the original Hebrew, not the way it has been watered down in translation, it is going to reframe everything you believe about your role as a parent and everything you assume about your child's potential. I have been working with families for 38 years. I have sat across from mothers who were convinced their children were simply not gifted. I have worked with fathers who blamed the schools, blamed the teachers, blamed themselves. I have reviewed report cards that broke parents' hearts and watched those same parents transmit that heartbreak unknowingly into the home environment where their child was supposed to feel safe. And in almost every single one of those conversations, across almost 4 decades, I kept coming back to the same verse. One verse from the book of Proverbs that does not just describe how children learn. It predicts with almost frightening accuracy whether your child will succeed or spend their life struggling against a current they cannot name. Jewish families represent 0.2% of the world's population, and yet 22% of all Nobel Prize winners have been Jewish. That is not a coincidence. That is not genetics. That is a system of raising children, of understanding children, that has been refined and transmitted for thousands of years. And at the very center of that system, before any method or practice or ritual, there is this one verse. Today, I want to share it with you. And more importantly, I want to show you what it actually means. Not the surface translation, but the deep Talmudic interpretation that has guided the most successful educational tradition in human history. What I am sharing today is part of a larger framework I have spent 38 years studying, testing, and organizing. I call it the 7 Torah laws of the genius child. This verse is the foundation of one of those 7 laws, a law so fundamental that without truly understanding it, every other method, every other technique, every other practice you apply to your child's learning will never reach its full potential. It is like building a house on a foundation that is slightly off. The higher you build, the more the structure leans. Stay with me until the end of this video, because the application I am going to describe, what this verse actually calls you to do in your home, starting this week, may be the most important thing I share in this entire series. I grew up in Brooklyn. My grandfather, Rabbi Mordecai Kaplan, was a teacher in our neighborhood for 47 years. He taught 3 generations of families in that same building on Eastern Parkway. From the time I was a young child, I used to sit beside him when he received parents in the evenings, fathers who came worried, mothers who came heartbroken, grandparents who came speaking in Yiddish about grandchildren they barely recognized anymore. And I remember watching my grandfather listen to them, really listen. He would not speak for a long time. He would just take in what they were saying, nodding slowly, his eyes never leaving theirs. And when he finally did speak, he almost always came back to this same verse. He would say to me afterward, "Aaron, every child comes into the world as a neshama, a soul, with a particular way of being in the world. Not a problem to be corrected, a way to be discovered. Your job as a parent is not to shape the child into what you imagine they should become. Your job is to discover who the child already is. And when you truly discover the child, everything that seemed like a problem reveals itself as a gift that was simply pointed in the wrong direction." I carried that teaching with me when I went to Yeshiva University to study Talmud and Jewish philosophy, and then to Teachers College at Columbia University to study educational psychology. And in both of those worlds, the ancient wisdom of the Torah and the modern science of human development confirmed each other in ways that still astonish me after nearly 4 decades. The researchers were arriving, through laboratories and longitudinal studies, at the same conclusions that the sages had encoded in sacred texts 3,000 years earlier. But my real education came from the families themselves. It came from sitting in living rooms in New Jersey, and classrooms in Florida, and dining tables in California, working directly with children who had been told they were slow or difficult or simply not built for academic success. And again, when I sat with those families and we returned to these ancient laws, I watched something shift. Not immediately, not always easily, but with the consistency that comes when a practice is aligned with something true. Before I go further, I want to ask you something. If you are a parent watching this and you have ever had the quiet, persistent sense that your child is not being fully seen, not truly understood by the adults who are responsible for their education and development, I want you to write the word seen in the comments right now. Just that one word, because this conversation is for you. And I want to know how many of you are carrying that feeling. Here is what is actually happening in most schools today. I say this not to attack teachers, because I have deep respect for the work that teachers do under impossible conditions. I say it because parents deserve to understand the gap, the enormous gap, between how modern educational systems treat children and what the oldest and most successful educational tradition in human history teaches us about how children actually learn and develop. The modern school system was not designed to develop genius. This is historical fact, not opinion. The compulsory schooling model that most Western countries inherited was shaped in the 18th and 19th centuries, heavily influenced by the needs of industrializing economies. Children were grouped by age rather than by developmental readiness. They were assessed primarily through standardized performance rather than through understanding and reasoning. They were rewarded for compliance and penalized for divergence. And when a child did not fit that mold, the system created labels: slow learner, struggling reader, learning disabled, behavioral problem. And those labels traveled home in backpacks and settled into dinner conversations and became part of the story the family told about who that child was. I have seen this happen more times than I can count. A child who asks too many questions is called disruptive. A child who learns through movement is called unfocused. A child who processes information more slowly but with extraordinary depth is called behind. And their parents receive those messages, and they carry them home with the full weight of institutional authority behind them. And slowly, sometimes without even realizing it, they begin to transmit those beliefs to the child. And the child, who trusts their parents more than they trust anyone else in the world, receives those beliefs and incorporates them into their identity. A 2019 study published in the journal Educational Psychology Review documented something that the Talmud already knew thousands of years ago. Teacher expectations directly and measurably shape student outcomes, not just academically, but neurologically. When a child is consistently perceived as capable, the brain responds to challenges with engagement. When a child has internalized the message that they are limited, the brain activates its threat response in the presence of academic demands, and the neurological capacity for learning is literally impaired. The belief creates the biology. Now, let me tell you what most parents do when they sense that something is not working. The 3 most common responses I see across 4 decades of working with families are these. They push harder, they add more structure, and they increase the pressure around performance. More tutoring, more supervised homework time, more anxiety around test results. And I want to explain to you from a Talmudic perspective why all three of those responses, however well-intentioned, tend to deepen the problem rather than solve it. Pushing harder without first understanding the child's nature is what Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch described as an inversion of the parent's role. You are no longer in service of the child's development. You are in service of your own fear about the child's future. And children feel that distinction with extraordinary precision. A child who senses that they are being pushed because the parent is afraid does not feel supported. They feel like a source of their parent's distress. And that emotional reality shapes how they relate to learning for years, sometimes for life. Adding more structured academic time without addressing the emotional relationship between the child and the act of learning treats a spiritual problem as a logistical one. The child has not concluded that they are incapable because they lack exposure to more content. They have concluded it because something in the way learning has been delivered to them has made them feel that their particular mind is not the right kind of mind. More tutoring in that context is more evidence of the same problem. And pressure around performance. This one is perhaps the most documented in both ancient wisdom and modern research. Cognitive psychologist Robert Bjork at UCLA has shown across multiple studies that high-stakes pressure applied at the wrong developmental moments creates interference in memory consolidation and retrieval. The child performs worse under pressure. The parent sees worse performance and increases the pressure, and the cycle becomes self-reinforcing in a direction that no parent ever intended. None of this is the parent's fault. Parents do what they were taught to do. They apply the tools their culture gave them. And what I have come to understand, and this is the central insight that organizes the 7 Torah laws of the genius child, is that what looks like a performance problem in a child is almost always a discovery problem. The adults responsible for that child have not yet discovered who the child actually is. And without that discovery, every method applied is working from the wrong map. This is exactly what the verse from Proverbs tells us. And this is what I want to share with you now. The verse is from Mishlei, the book of Proverbs, chapter 22, verse 6. In Hebrew, Chanoch lanar al pidarko, gam ki yaskin lo, yasur mimenu. Most English translations render it something like this: train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. That translation is not wrong, but it is profoundly incomplete. And the incompleteness is what has caused generations of parents and educators to misread this verse, and to misread their children entirely. The phrase that changes everything is al pi darko. Al pi means according to. Darko means his way, his road, his particular direction. The verse is not telling you to train a child in the way you have decided is correct. It is not instructing you to impose a path. It is telling you to train the child according to the child's own inherent path, according to the way that is already inside them, waiting to be recognized. This is the foundation of what I identify as law number 2 of the 7 Torah laws of the genius child. I have spent 38 years studying these 7 laws, tracing them through the Talmud, through Pirkei Avot, through the teachings of Maimonides and the Ben Ish Chai and the Maharal of Prague. And I am telling you that this law, this principle of teaching the child according to their own inherent darko, is the law that either unlocks or blocks every other practice in the system. Because if you are applying the right methods to the wrong map of the child, those methods cannot work. You are navigating with someone else's compass. Rabbi Yosef Chaim of Baghdad, the great 19th century sage known as the Ben Ish Chai, wrote that this verse from Proverbs contains a sacred obligation that applies not just to parents, but to every person entrusted with a child's formation. He interpreted Alpi Darko as a mandate to study the child before attempting to teach the child. Not study the subject matter to be taught. Study the child themselves. Observe their rhythms, understand how they process the world, learn what makes them light up and what shuts them down. And only then, only from that foundation of discovery, begin to teach. The Rambam, Maimonides, in Hilchot Talmud Torah, his laws governing Torah study, was equally direct. A teacher, he wrote, must adjust the manner and method of instruction to the nature of the student, not the other way around. The student does not contort themselves to fit the method. The method is shaped to serve the student. When I explain this to parents today, many of them become quiet. Some become emotional because they realize, sometimes for the first time in their child's educational journey, that it was never their child who was wrong. It was the alignment between the child and the approach that was off. Now, I want to be very specific about what this law asks of you in practice, because this is not an abstract teaching. It has precise applications, and they begin this week. The first practice that flows from law number 2 is what I call the sacred observation period. Before you change anything in how you engage with your child's learning, before you add a program, remove a privilege, restructure their schedule, or bring in outside help, you do nothing except observe for 7 days. The number 7, as I speak about throughout this series, is not arbitrary in the Jewish tradition. 7 days of creation, 7 branches of the menorah. 7 is the number that represents completeness in the Torah. And 7 days of disciplined, patient observation will give you more usable information about your child than 7 months of well-intentioned interventions applied without it. During those 7 days, you are watching for 3 specific things. The first is when your child's energy and curiosity activate without prompting, not when you sit them down to study. When do they naturally lean in? What time of day does their mind come alive on its own? The Talmud in Tractat Barakot acknowledges that the human mind and spirit have rhythms, and working with those rhythms rather than imposing an external schedule against them is not indulgence. It is intelligence. Most parents schedule learning time based on when it is convenient for the family's day. The Torah asks you to schedule it based on when the child's mind is most naturally receptive. The second thing you observe is what kind of problems your child is naturally drawn to solving. Not homework problems, life problems, the kinds of challenges they pursue without being asked. A child who spends hours building structures with whatever materials are at hand is revealing something essential about how their mind organizes the world. A child who persistently asks why things work the way they work, even when the adults around them are tired of the question, is demonstrating the chutzpah of intellectual appetite that the Talmud celebrates as one of the highest traits a student can possess. A child who remembers every detail of every story they have ever been told, even stories they heard years ago, is showing you a particular architecture of mind that, once understood and honored, becomes a profound academic gift. The third thing you observe is how your child responds to being wrong. This is perhaps the most diagnostic observation of all. A child who shuts down withdraws, or becomes defensive when they make an error has learned from somewhere in their environment that mistakes are evidence of inadequacy. That is a learned response, not an innate one. A child who becomes curious when they encounter an error, who asks why they got it wrong and what the correct path would have been, has already internalized what Pirkei Avot teaches in chapter 4, verse 1. Who is wise? One who learns from every person and every experience. That orientation toward error, treating it as information rather than verdict, does not develop by accident. It develops because someone in the child's life has modeled it consistently. After 7 days of genuine observation, you will know things about your child that no school report has ever communicated to you. You will see the Darko, the road, that Proverbs 22:6 says is already inside them, and that knowledge becomes the foundation for everything that follows in the system. The second practice that law number 2 calls for is what I think of as narrating the path. This is the active complement to observation. Once you have watched your child with genuine attention and without agenda, you begin to name what you have seen, not directing them, not prescribing, naming, reflecting back to them, in simple and honest language, what you have actually observed. You come alive when you are working with your hands. You remember stories with extraordinary precision. You solve problems by talking through them out loud. And when you do that, you arrive at answers that surprise even you. These observations, delivered consistently and without any agenda attached to them, do something that cannot be replicated by any curriculum or tutoring program. They give the child a true map of themselves. And a child who has a true map of themselves begins to navigate their own learning with a kind of authority and ownership that no external pressure could ever produce. This connects directly to what developmental psychologist Leah Vygotsky identified as the zone of proximal development, the space between what a child can do independently and what they can do with appropriate support. When a child knows their own strengths and their own path, they can identify that zone themselves. They become partners in their own development rather than recipients of someone else's agenda for them. That shift from recipient to partner is one of the most profound changes I have witnessed in the families I have worked with over 4 decades. I want to share something honest with you because I think it is important. There was a period in my own life during my busiest years of consulting when I was traveling frequently and working with families in multiple states, when I became too focused on delivering the system and not attentive enough to the individual. My own household paid a price for that. I was helping other parents discover their children's paths, while at home I was applying the same structured expectations to every child, without pausing to truly observe. My son went through a very difficult period around age 11. He became withdrawn, resistant, and I could see him pulling away from learning in a way that scared me. And when I finally stopped, when I sat down and spent 7 days simply watching him without agenda, without a plan, without any of my 38 years of expertise in the way, I realized with real pain that I had been teaching him according to my image of who he was rather than according to his actual Darko. It took time to rebuild. The trust between a parent and a child, once strained, requires patience and humility to restore. But the verse led me back. It always does. What I see in the broader educational landscape today concerns me, and I think every parent watching this should pay attention to it. A 2023 report from the National Center for Education Statistics in the United States found that reading and mathematics proficiency among fourth and eighth graders had dropped to their lowest levels in over 3 decades. At the same time, we are investing more in educational technology, more in standardized curriculum, more in testing infrastructure than any previous generation in history. More tools, worse outcomes. Because tools without the right philosophy are not solutions. They are sophisticated versions of the same error. And the philosophy, the foundational understanding of what a child actually is and how learning actually happens, has been absent from mainstream education for a very long time. My grandfather taught me these 7 laws, not as a system, but as stories, as separate teachings spread across many years of conversation. I was 35 years old before I began to understand how they connected. Before I saw that they were not independent ideas, but a single integrated architecture, each law reinforcing and unlocking the others in ways that no single law could achieve alone. I have spent the last 20 years organizing them into a form that any parent, Jewish or not, religious or not, can understand and apply. What I have shared with you today is the second of those 7 laws, and it is foundational. But understanding how this law works in combination with the other 6, how the discovery practice connects to the Chavutah method, how the observation period creates the conditions for a pilpul to emerge, how Alpi Darko interfaces with the Shabbat principle, that level of understanding belongs to the full system. Let me bring you to what I want you to carry with you from this teaching. The first thing is this: Proverbs 22:6 is not a gentle encouragement. It is an instruction, Alpi Darko, according to the child's own way. Your child came into the world with a particular road already inside them. Your most sacred responsibility as a parent is not to build that road, but to discover it. Every method, every practice, every ritual I will share across the series of 7 laws rests on that foundation. Without it, the other practices are techniques without a home. The second thing is this: the most powerful action you can take for your child this week is not to add something new to their life. It is to begin observing